One of the things that I discovered in writing this memoir was that we actually were dealing with something very similar to what the soldiers were dealing with coming home to what we would call the real world, what they called the real world. Was that all of a sudden the pressure and the intensity and the focus from that period was gone from your life, and you had to try and find a way to use your values and do something productive and constructive with the things you believed in. And it was very much like post-combat syndrome. It's like all of a sudden you had to get a job, and raise a family and do ordinary things without that kind of pressure. We did discover, however, later that the scrutiny and the surveillance continued, even up into, and some people up into the 90s. Carl Bernstein, who was a famous author who wrote the books on Nixon and some other books, Vail and a few other things, discovered that his file was still active in the 90s. And so this is not uncommon. So you really can't shake it.
With the FBI.
Yeah, once you're there, the FBI file. You can take the boy out of the movement, but you can't take the movement out of the boy. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to start with a couple of stories from the book, from the memoir. Going way back, first one when I was 13 years old. Now I grew up in a left-wing family. My parents were my grandfather was a organizer for the Garment Workers Union in before World War I, 1913. My grandmother was a suffragette. My dad wanted to go to the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. His parents didn't let him, so he ran away to the dock strike in San Francisco. He was on the docks in 1934 with Harry Bridges. So, and he was a very strong union person. My uncle was a strong union person. My mom used to bring me up and she would say, "Finish your vegetables and never cross the picket line." So that was pretty much what I was brought up with. So we never violated the strike line. I had that experience when I was about 7 years old. She told me that. Now, this is a story when I was about 13 years old. I was not much older than you, and this is when I got in trouble. Okay. 1958, we lived outside of Washington, D.C., in the suburbs of D.C. 1958, I was in the 7th grade at Belt Junior High School in Silver Springs, Maryland, 10 miles outside of Washington. It was required that the New Testament be read every day in homeroom. When your name was called, you had to go up and read from the New Testament. In that class of 30 students, there were at least 16 Jewish kids, maybe 20 if you count the ones with blonde hair who were trying to pass. In front of me sat Ruby Compton. Ruby was a 13-year-old blonde with a sensuous pout and early noteworthy curves. Ruby looked like how Marilyn Monroe must have looked at the same age. Ruby had some reads from the Bible, an incongruous image in itself. This was my turn. Our teacher, Mr. Schussler, had been a Marine in the Korean War. He was a wrestling coach. He was over 6 feet tall and built like a weightlifter with a blonde, flat-top haircut and hands like sledgehammers. He was a nice guy. With those hands, he could afford to be a nice guy. Mr. Schussler called my name and held out the Bible for me to read. I had no idea what possessed me. Perhaps I was channeling my television hero and moral compass at the time, Davy Crockett, who always said, "Be sure you're right, then go ahead." "No thanks," I said. "I'll pass." I could feel the shocked, cold stares all around me. Mr. Schussler's voice got deeper. He said, "It's your turn." Again I said, "No thanks, I'll pass." It wasn't my holy book. Miraculously, at that moment, the bell rang. I was saved. However, somebody must have called my house. When I got home, my mom asked me the whole story. The next day, my parents went with me to school. The office was crawling with more lawyers than ants on a chocolate cake. At that age, I was mostly interested in getting a peek down Ruby Compton's blouse. I'd never heard about the prayer in the schools controversy. I must have pushed a pretty hot button by opening my big mouth. This became the story of my life. On the next Monday homeroom, instead of passing the Bible around, Mr. Schussler, staring daggers at me, said, "You don't have to read the Bible. It's voluntary." The last word sounded like a curse. My innocent action had contributed to a shift in the entire school district, perhaps even beyond. A single small action by one person at the right moment can change things big time. Don't forget it. I'd become that cannon on the 5-mile front of the First Amendment. I'm pretty sure Ruby Compton didn't give a damn, but I had a hunch that my reputation as a troublemaker was going to follow me. I prayed to be airlifted out of there. My prayers were answered. That summer, we moved out to California. So you never know when something is going to happen to you, and before you know it, that you're moved by values that dominate your life. And you don't have a word for it. You don't have a definition for it. It's just your reaction to things. About the same time, my mom also we had lived in a white neighborhood. It was all white neighborhood. God knows what they thought of all the Jews out there, but it was a white neighborhood. And we had the only black person that came by was the garbage man that came to pick up the trash. And I told this story a couple of times, but it's very important to me. He came into the house and asked my mom for a glass of water. This was a cold winter day. And my mom looked at him and she gave him a glass of water. I was about 9 years old at the time. And she gave him a glass of water, and then she poured a cup of hot coffee and the cream and sugar and pushed it over to him. And he looked at her like, oh my goodness. Drank the coffee and everything. He left. And I was puzzled by that, because he only asked for a glass of water. But I knew right then, anybody that came to the house was my family's guest, in the winter, you got a hot cup of coffee. And so I said to my mom, I said, why did you do that? What did you do? And she just riveted my eyes, and she said, you give a person what they have a right to, whether they ask for it or not. So we rolled the clock forward quite a bit, and I got in high school. There's another story. When I got here to California, that's the Bible story. When I got to California at 14 years old, we moved here to Fresno. It was really hot in the summertime. Swamp coolers were going all over the place. And I'd never seen anything like this. I'd never been around Latinos. There'd never been any Mexican people, Latino people in the place that I neighbored. So this was, all I knew was black and white. So this was like confusing to me, And so you just figured out there were a lot of new people to get to know, a lot of new people around you. And so we did that. But we thought we'd settle down. I was going to have my bar mitzvah in Fresno after we moved there. And so we had a little experience that we were not prepared for. In 1959, during my 7th grade year, my father had bought a printing business in Fresno, California, a region with dry climate and crops of cotton, figs, grapes, olives, oranges, and melons growing even within the city limits. We moved to the promised land. I expected to see movie stars all over the place. Maybe Marilyn Monroe. Maybe Annette Funicello. I just settled for Sandra Dee. It seemed like a big farm town with a far slower rhythm of life than the East Coast. When we arrived, it was midsummer in the desert climate of the San Joaquin Valley. The temperature reached 80 degrees about 10 minutes after sunrise and skyrocketed to 100 before noon. We lived in a neighborhood that was perhaps 20 years old or more. All around us were small, single-story apartments, buildings of little stucco or clapboard houses. Most of the people were brown-skinned with black hair. They all spoke Spanish. The lawns were too small for recreation, so the families picnicked and played on the big lawns of the hospital in the center of the neighborhood. Because of the hospital of the neighborhood, the ambulance and cop sirens wailed all night. We had moved to a Latino area, but we didn't know it. At our congregation was a boy named David, who was 5 years older than me. He had a number tattooed on his forearm. When he was an infant, David had been branded like an animal in a German concentration camp. David had the eyes of an old man. In January, only a few weeks after my bar mitzvah, trouble found our congregation on the corner of nowhere. I think it was down on Shields Avenue was where the temple was, either Shields or Dakota, I'm not sure. Temple Beth Jacob. One Saturday, everyone arrived at the synagogue to find police cars filling the parking lot. The rabbi and congregation leaders were all standing around in shock and fear. The women were all huddled in the car seats. Swastikas had been spray painted on the doors, walls, and windows. Molotov cocktails had been thrown at the wooden doors of the sanctuary. They were scarred and burned. That night, there's pictures of this actually in the book. That night, homes of some of the congregation were also targeted with vandalism and hate phone calls. It was our own little Kristallnacht, right there in paradise. The community, some of them German concentration camp survivors, were scared. Until then, I only saw this kind of thing in history books or newspaper stories about the Deep South. Now here it was on my beardless face. The men divided their nights standing guard at the synagogue for weeks thereafter. Just having become a man, I wanted to go and do with my share, but my dad said no. History was becoming personal. Two big, blonde, blue-eyed football stars, the valedictorian and salutatorian of the richest high school in town, bragged about it in the locker room. The cops came calling. The boys lost their spots at the top of the class. They were denied Harvard. Did this put a fire under my feelings of disassociation from the American mainstream? You bet your bagel knife it did. Even in layback California, I learned that I was carrying my future politics on my face. I was getting the idea that manhood was going to elude a hell of a lot more than shaving, driving a car, and kissing girls. There's a happy end to this tale. I discovered that Adrian, the princess of the Blackstone swim park, who always wore a great bikini, was a Sephardic Jew. Thus, she had the dark hair and skin. We dated and stayed friends for years. So, even as a young person, the situation in terms of racism, came into my life. We began reading stories about the farm workers during the Bracero program, and my parents paid particular attention to this because they understood that feeling of being disassociated. It was nothing new, but here we were in a completely different environment, different situation. Well, I found myself at Fresno State College, and I'll go back to some high school things later, but I came back and found myself at Fresno State in 1964-65, 65-66 year. And I had a teacher there. His name was Frank Vergis in the philosophy department. And Frank did he started to do what they call a teach-in, where there would be a whole day of speakers from all sides, people pro-war, people anti-war, in all different philosophies. And he was going to put that on shortly before he wanted to put that on. He was taken to the office up to the administration, and he was threatened with losing his job if he did that, even though it was completely open to everybody. The whole idea of a free exchange of ideas was threatening to the administration of a university. Now, I don't get that. I don't get that, and neither did Frank. Well, he became very demoralized. He became very upset. He left the school. And I didn't hear or see Frank for quite a few years, and I had no idea I was going to run into him again. But I did. Okay. After finishing at Fresno State, I went down to Santa Barbara. And when I was at Santa Barbara, I used to have this organized a little bit. Yeah, here we go. When I was at Santa Barbara, I was in a theater program. I expected to be rich and famous in record time. And studying theater, and became interested in labor theater and political theater. You read about the Federal Theater Project, and you read about some of the other theater companies. And at that point in time, political theater was just happening. The grape strike was going on. This was 66, 67. And my mother read an article in the newspaper about it. My mom read an article, and she says, there's a guy here who started this theater company. His name is Luis Valdez. And it says here that he was at San Jose State while you were there. Hit me like a rock. Luis and I had been friends at San Jose State. He sat in the green room and we talked, we were at parties. I did not see his production of Shrunken Head of Pancho Villa, which was there, but I took the set down afterwards. So here I am, loosely associated already with the people connected with that. Okay? And that was kind of interesting. I thought about it. At San Jose, I thought, well, maybe when I get rich and famous, I'll go see him. So I'm at UC Santa Barbara in 66, 67, and during this period of time, Joan Baez and Ira Sandpearl, who were doing the nonviolence movement, were coming and giving speeches. They were presenting speeches. And I thought I'd go. Went to hear all the speeches there. They had wonderful university speaking program. And so she showed up at Santa Barbara. And I was still unclear really about my politics at that point. And said, UC Santa Barbara hosted a lecture series featuring such thinkers as Buckminster Fuller, John Cage, and Joan Baez. These are important artists and thinkers of the time. I went to hear all of them. Joan came with an elegant peace-pacifist Irish sandpearl. Their philosophy of nonviolence was sweeping the world. Its effectiveness as a religiously based principle was eroding of opposition to the civil rights movement, even within the segregation of South. 2,000 people filled all the seats in the hall, sat in the aisles, and stood around the walls. Thunderous applause erupted as Joan came on the stage. She began, "I'm not here today as an entertainer. I'm here as a citizen of the world, just like you. All of us must live with what we do in the world every day. We have to decide if we're going to make it a safer place in the face of nuclear war or let all hell break loose because we did nothing." She was speaking to each one of us at that point in our lives, deciding what we were going to do with our lives at that moment. So this is one of the plateaus in me deciding that I was going to become the pretty radical, pretty political. Now, we flip ahead to a year or two later. I found myself, how these things happen, how I get in these places, I have no idea. I did not get accepted to the graduate school that I wanted to go to. One of them, another one wasn't going to give me enough scholarship, so I decided I would stay in California. And this was the point at which if you didn't have a student deferment, you were going to be in an outfit of stunning jungle green. So, and that color didn't go with my ensemble, so I decided I would stay here. So I went to, I decided I would go to San Francisco State. Are you doing okay? Is it all right? Good. I'll tell you another funny story later. Anyway, so I was at San Francisco State. I was at San Francisco State, and before I got there, I needed a place to live. I needed a place to crash. So a friend of mine, a friend. So I know a guy that's got an apartment. He'll let you crash in his apartment. I said, okay, fine. So I filled my car full of my junk, and I went up there, and I stayed in this place. I actually slept on a bench in the kitchen because all the place was full while I was looking for an apartment. Well, that was okay, because it was a very interesting house. There was a lot of meetings and a lot of people going in and out. Okay, so I'm going like, what's going on? And I had no idea. And so I finally found an apartment, moved out of there, found my own place, and I go to San Francisco State within weeks of the beginning of the strike. There's a guy up on the podium who's the leader of the Third World Liberation Front named Roger Alvarado. That was the guy whose house I was rooming in. Okay, so Roger and I, this is like the connection to Luis Valdez, right? That connection, he talked with me and he convinced me to get involved in working with the drama department at San Francisco State. A lot of these kids were not political, but a lot of them were. This was a campus where there were like maybe 3% non-white students in a city that was 70% non-white. And all the white students walked out in support of the Third World Liberation Front, in support of the ethnic studies program. And that's so like you're talking 85-90% of the students supported it. And there were thousands out there every day. The police showed up with 600 guys, a lot of them with machine guns, a lot of them with those big billy clubs and the flak jackets. This was the first time they debuted this fashion statement, in America. That phalanx of those cops looking like that was pretty scary, pretty impressive. So we had to deal with that. We dealt with that every single day when we showed up. Well, I got involved with the theater students, and I said, we got to do something about this. So we did these little skits about the strike and about what was going on. And we would go to the shopping malls, and we would go to in front of City Hall, and I started getting phone calls about taking them to other college campuses. Sacramento State, I don't know that we came to Fresno State, but I directed these little things. I was only like 20, 21 years old. I directed these little things, and I did the booking from the theater department's office. I'm sitting there, the secretary lets me in, and I'm using the theater department's phone to book all these shows around the state and to send the little troops out. Pretty soon, one day, I'm sitting there in the office, and it has one of those glass panes between me and the outside. And all of a sudden, this secretary throws herself up against the glass pane like a bug, and I'm hearing voices and I'm seeing shadows out there. And she sticks her head in the door and she says, "You got to get out of here. They're going to try and arrest you." They were going to try and bust me, but they had to go past her. And they had to find a woman police officer to frisk her. Well, there weren't very many police officers that were women in San Francisco in 1968, so this took them a while to find somebody. I think they probably found like a meter maid to come in and frisk her. Meanwhile, I got out of there. But she said something funny and important. She said, the only way they could have known you were in here was if the university was allowing the police to tap the university phone system, because it was a closed phone system. You had to dial 9 to get out of that system. So they're listening in on all the phones in the university. And then I guess I won't be telling any more dirty jokes on the phone. But I had to get out of there. But that was what it was like at San Francisco State. Well, while I'm at the strike at San Francisco State, I come out one day, and this happens. While the strike at San Francisco State grounded on, I awaited the determination of my conscientious objective status. I was depressed and very scared. Then my CO classification came through. I would still have to serve, but I could choose to social service agency stateside. I cannot tell you what a relief that was. I waited to do my draft resistance, which I had not done at the end for a couple of reasons. I was waiting until there was a moment where it was going to be real theatrical. You better believe I was going to pick the moment where it wasn't going to get ignored. One of the later days of the strike, I dodged the cops a few times already that day. I watched them busting some guy out of the middle of the crowd. As they cuffed him and stuffed him into a cop car, he lifted his head. Somehow we made eye contact. It was Frank Burgess, my former philosophy professor from Fresno State. I had no idea he was now teaching at San Francisco State. These reconnections keep cycling in all my life. Before they pushed him into the police car, he smiled and yelled, "I see you got the point of the philosophy lectures, Mr. Ice." The encounter with Professor Burgess was when the decision to devote my life to taking apart a power structure profiting from unfairness became visceral. It didn't become radicalized in a single moment. I didn't happen to take a college class, read a single book, or hearing a single speech. It happens by answering my heart. It happened while we were running from the cops who were chasing me for trying to make this a fair country. It caught me like a tidal wave. I'd seen people get it watching an agitprop theater performance, connecting their own lives to the bigger picture. All of a sudden, my theater training had a focus. The people in power were relentlessly driving the juggernaut that crushed the poor and disadvantaged. And Mario Savio had said, this was never going to change unless we decided to stop the machine. We had to throw ourselves on the gears. It was my turn. I knew what I was going to do, what I had to do. My personal switches slammed closed. So that was kind of when I decided I was going to do it. The next thing that happened a few weeks later was, lo and behold, the theater department there was having a radical theater festival. They brought the Mime Troupe and Bread and Puppet Theater from New York. These are people that did political theater in the streets. They were really funny and very important. And you can look them up you can get on your computer and look them up on YouTube, and you can see their plays. They're really good. And another one there was Teatro Campesino. Farm Workers Theater was there. So here I am, and there's Luis Valdez, my old theater buddy, from college. How am I making these connections? So I helped them do with their tech. I was primarily a designer and technician. I helped them with the tech for the show. And his little brother Daniel Valdez, and I talked, and they said, we're moving to Fresno. They were moving from Del Rey. We're moving to Fresno. We don't got a tech guy. We don't have somebody who can do all that. Would you be interested in coming to Fresno and being part of the theater company? So I'm getting an invitation to the foremost radical theater company on the West Coast, one of the 3 or 4 in the world. This is pretty good. So I thought about it, and at that particular moment, it was very clear to me that my professors at San Francisco State, who were not all supportive of the strike, were not going to give me a graduate degree. I mean, one guy just came up to me and said, "You're not getting a degree." He was on my committee to decide if I would get a degree. That was not going to happen. So I was going to go to Fresno and make a fresh start. So I joined the Teatro. I connected with the draft resistance when I was there, and I became trouble full time. I became trouble full time. Well, my life really changed a lot when I got down there, and there were a lot of things that people didn't really know about that. And I've got a couple of things here. One here that I have to talk about: the draft resistance movement. Here it is. This is a fun one. This is when I'm living out in the draft resistance in Fresno. And we had some small farmhouses. We had 4 farmhouses out in a fig orchard out off First Avenue. It's now all tract homes out there. Those people got no idea the vibes underneath their house. And that was where we lived. We had a printing press out there in an office. We had meetings, we had potlucks, we had dinners out there, and that was the center for what we had to do. And this is what it was like to be involved in those days. As far as the FBI was concerned, anyone who didn't vote Republican was a commie blank lover, probably a Jew, and maybe even a queer. In my case, it was 3 out of 4. The FBI was sure we were working for an evil empire, even if we didn't know it. Their job was to save us from ourselves. They couldn't embrace the idea that we had a right to object to the course our government was taking, and that all the facts showed we were right. On second thought, that's probably what pissed them off. Tapping a phone conversation was and still is one of the primary tools hoping to connect you to the big conspiracy in the sky. Hence the invention of the wiretap court order. For their permission, lawmen needed probable cause. This chicken or egg situation meant there had to be some kind of surveillance before the invasive process could legally begin. Early computers were used to record repeated contacts with specific phone numbers that were already on their list. This was pretty much recording the numbers that you called 4 or 5 times from your phone. They would put that on their list. This record supposedly gave the G-men probable cause. How those people got on the list in the first place was never questioned. The number of associated individuals ran into the hundreds of thousands, probably millions by the end of the war. The process works like a comedy written by Franz Kafka. If a suspected person calls the same number several times, the computer assumes that number is linked to nefarious activities. The fun fact about the official enemies list is that once you're on the list, you're never off. One of the obvious problems with this system is that the content of the phone call is not considered. There was a Me and Ed's pizza place on Blackstone Avenue we called nearly every week. They're probably still on the enemies list, even though their 4-meat pizza special is fantastic. Does anyone ever check to see why the first call was ever recorded? Don't be silly. There's a job security thing in the government. Once a phone call number shows up some magic number of times, the feds listen in on the calls. This requires that they install equipment in the line. There used to be a guy with the headphones in the basement of your apartment building, or a phony utility truck outside. Between my draft resistance work, El Teatro Campesino, calls with civil rights and black power groups, and my family, who had leftist leanings as far back as the Great Depression, my phone was overflowing with red-hot numbers, and I do mean red. There was often a utility company truck at the end of our street working on the wires. Remember that?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So clever. I mean, what's a potato chip truck doing with it? Never mind. Okay. With the equipment back then, when we dialed or answered the call, there were so many audible clicks on the line, we had to wait until they all finished hooking up. We could begin a conversation. There was a small power drop caused by every wiretap. This is analog equipment. Okay. Sometimes the power draw from multiple devices was so strong that the call faded in and out or disconnected entirely. One night, my fellow counselor, Ron Thiessen, was so angry at all this that he telephoned the phone company. I was sitting across from him. The following exchange took place. Ron: "Is this the phone company? Repair department?" Voice on the other end: "Yes, how can we help you?" Ron: "You can disconnect all the damned wiretaps. There's so many clicks on the line, I have to wait to start talking. Sometimes our calls even disconnect." The voice says, "Oh, I don't know what you're talking about." He said, "Oh, give me a break. I see the trucks out here all the time with lead wires running down from the connection box, the voice on the other end says, "Oh, you must be out at the Resistance House." Our technician says, "No worry, the tabs shouldn't interfere with your calls." One might consider that the amount of surveillance is a backhanded barometer of one's radical effectiveness. In a perverse way, showing up on their list might be proof you were doing something worth their attention. As the Dalai Lama said, if you think you can't make a difference with continual individual activism, that a small, insistent voice is not important. Try sleeping in a dark room with one mosquito. So that was what life was like, in those days under those circumstances. I ain't lying, I don't want to call them. It was pretty amazing. There were sometimes they tried to plant plants in there. People who were ringers, who were FBI people, and sometimes there were probably people we never caught. There was one guy who made an offer to one of our friends that if he would rat on us, that they would cancel his student loan. He turned around and gave us his name, and I put him in the back seat of the car and drove him out to Kerman and dropped him out of the car. So that kind of stuff does happen and can happen. They're much more insidious and they're much better at it today. One of the things that brought me together with the Teatro in a funny kind of way was Cesar Chavez's son shows up one day out the draft resistance needing to be draft counsel. And I was the only one who was there. So I draft counseled Cesar Chavez's son. So those brought those things together. The 60s went on like that. When I was left the Fresno area and I got married the first time, we moved up to the mountains in a small town of Westwood, California. Westwood, California is so small that it's not even on some maps. It's near Susanville. And snow is pretty good up there, maybe 10, 12 feet. I wouldn't want to be up there right now. You used to get bears in downtown, they would be right there. And so it was a very remote area. It actually had a very important strike in the 30s during the AFL-CIO period. There was a big lumber strike up there. So the people up there were all working class, a lot of vets living there, and they got me to do a theater class. They asked me to teach a theater class out there with the locals, and I had a fun time. We did a play. There's a play called The 101st. It's a wonderful play, short play, about a guy. The New York Times every year publishes a list of 100 most needy families, and they publish that name, and then people donate to those families. Okay, and there's a guy in this play. This poor guy, every year he's the 101st. He can't get on the list. This is upward mobility in reverse, And he tries, and he has a whole speech about things that work. He says, your lung cancer will get you on the list, right? So he has a great story about that. His mother-in-law's in a shopping cart, and she can only say one phrase: "If I had me $500, I'd get me to Miami, Florida." So he's got this totally dysfunctional family. But the thing is all the people that lived in Westwood were on welfare or food stamps and struggling with trying to make sense of the early 70s. And this play was about them. So for that community, that kind of theater, dealing with them trying to struggle and deal with that, was the same as El Teatro Campesino helping the Campesino family. So that was a place where all of a sudden in the middle of nowhere, with 10 foot of snow around, I was given an opportunity with this play to do political theater for a community who never in their minds thought this would happen. So their own neighbors are in the play, stuff like that. We had a drawing. We had a raffle where people, all the money from the tickets went in, and we bought food stamps for somebody that won the ticket. They got like a month's food stamp. So that was a political opportunity to use the theater. Point being, no matter where you are, you can shape your activities to the needs of that community. And I found myself having to rethink what it was to be political, wherever you are, wherever you happen to be. As I find myself teaching university, moving around the country, I taught university in Georgia. I taught my university in Virginia. One of the things I discovered while teaching university in Georgia, a university professor will put a box outside the door. And in that box, students, if you're not there, they leave their term papers, so that you can grade their papers. And after that, then when you finish grading the papers, you put them in the box for them to pick them up, right? It's a normal system. Well, the box kept disappearing. The box kept disappearing. So I found that the head janitor, who I got to be friends with him. He and I were got on pretty well, and I said, what's happening with the box? This was the year 2000. Okay, this was the beginning of the 21st century, and this was Georgia, only about 15 miles outside of Atlanta. Okay, and he says, I said to put a sign on the box. He says, sign ain't going to do no good, Mr. Rice. I said, why? He said, because about a third of our janitors can't read. These are employees at a university in the 21st century, and they still couldn't read. So I wrote a letter to the president of the college and the governor, and I said that I think that one of the perks for the janitorial staff at that college was they should get reading lessons as an option, for one of their perks for teaching there. Well, they didn't renew my contract. They didn't renew my contract. So that kind of stuff that you deal with. So there I was in 2000 with one letter, getting on the wrong side. The other thing that happened was my boss, chair of the department, asked me if I knew if there were any homosexuals in the department. Now, what he was going to do with that information, I have no idea. First of all, how the hell was I supposed to know? Second of all, that was an improper question. It's not legal to ask that question. But I told him that. I said, I can't answer that question. I don't have the answer, and I don't think it's proper if you pursue it. So that was another reason why they didn't renew my contract. But I moved on to another school. I taught at a major school in Virginia, and I had another conversation with the janitor. We lived a few blocks from the campus, and there was a swimming pool. There was a park, and in the middle of the park was a place where there was a stone wall that rose about 3 feet and then just sort of disappeared in the ground. And I said, what is that? I asked the janitor who lived there. It was an older man like me. He was older than me at the time, probably pushing 70 at the time. I said, what is that? And tears started to come in his eyes. And he said, there used to be a swimming pool in that park. And in that swimming pool, but when they desegregated it, rather than let black people share that park, they filled it in. And evidently that was common all through the South. So now we're talking like 2004, 2000. We're moving into the 21st century. And it's making sense to me that we have a long way to go. Okay? Now, I want to just, I think I've done enough stories for now. I want to share one thing with you. Just yesterday, I had a conversation with a man who teaches at at Fresno State right now. And he tells me that black students today cannot cross that campus without being accosted by the police and asked to show if the library cards that they're holding that they have checkout slips. And the white students walking right past them will never be stopped. And they're confronted to show ID as the students if they're walking across the campus after dark, even if they're wearing like Fresno State t-shirt. This is going on today. So we have some work to do. You can find out who that cop is and who their watch commander is. Maybe we can get that guy a job somewhere else. So it just goes to show that it's never over. It doesn't change. Life is like that. I have situations where I live up in Shannonville also that we're dealing with. So the story of this life is that you find out who you are and you try to find a place to adjust. And then you got a bunch of stories, and if you're a decent writer, you can put them in a book. I'm sure this room is full of people who have great stories that they can tell. Okay, I think I've done all the damage I can do. Okay. Ask me anything you want. Thank you very much. What do you think? Ask me a question. Ask me a question. Can you do it? No? If something occurs, you go ahead. You can ask older people in your family about what that was like, and that's important because history is personal. History is like what happens to people's real lives. It's not in a book. It's what you deal with every single day. And you're going to do great things. Okay.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
Do you remember exactly where the El Teatro Campesino was in Fresno?
Yeah, sure. Right across from Ming's restaurant on Pond Avenue. And
You mean
the
on,
building
on Van Ness.
on Van Ness, right. You know, right across from Ming's, we're over there, you know.
So this was about
Greasy
68?
Chinese food, what more could you want?
68, you said?
Huh?
1968?
Yeah, 60, 68, 69, 70, we moved in there. End of
Okay.
68, right at the beginning of 69, we moved in over there.
Because we lived, I remember my mom talking about it. She said, oh yeah, Louis Valdez, that's where El Teatro
Yeah,
Campesino, but I thought
right
it was,
after that, the next people in that were something called the Building, which was the anti-war movement was in there. There was a food co-op in there, Larry Shee's food. There was a food co-op in there,
I
run by a
remember
guy named Ezra. He's a
Yeah.
funny little guy. And there was a feminist group had an office in there. David Harris, the Vietnam vets, had an office. David Harris was right behind me. We used to, you know, hang out in front and all the time. So
Yeah.
I knew David in high school
You know,
before he was in the resistance.
he just died a few weeks ago, I think. Too.
oh, he did.
Yeah, I did.
Yes, he did. No, yeah, I had an email with him. I invited him to this event, this week, and he said, "No, I'm not going to go. I can't make it." And he passed away about a week and a half later. So he thanked me, and we had a nice email exchange, for sure.
It brings memories of training that we get when we're in the movement about being careful on being caught for anything or
Oh,
and
man.
you know and it gets me very 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 scary
Oh, yeah,
of how much the technology has developed.
sure.
And now when I keep telling my friends or the people that are involved in stuff, don't put your information on Facebook or anything like that, because what you're doing is making it easier if you're in
Right.
any movement
Sure.
to come and get
Sure.
you.
Yeah.
You know, and people and a lot of people after I put that one, they start to change everything on it.
Sure.
But the technology has developed so much
Right.
that it's scary for anybody that is trying to be in unions or syndicates unions
Oh, sure.
and to try to organize people.
Oh, yeah.
Because they are on top of you
Right.
right then. Well, you know.
You know, but do it anyway, because the very fact that that's happening, if you're having a meeting with people and you explain to the people who want to be part of the union that instead of supporting that, what the government does is spy on you, that becomes an organizing point. They have to think about what that means, that something that they're asking for, a legitimate right to a decent salary, you know, or decent working condition, is something that the government considers suspect. That's the point. That's an organizing point that you could use in your favor. I mean, David Harris tells a great story about this. That he was driving around and he knew the FBI guy was like in the car behind him, right? The FBI driver, he pulls out from the curb. FBI guy pulls out from the curb. He pulls in with his dry cleaning. The FBI guy pulls in right behind him and waits. He goes and gets a burger. The FBI guy pulls in and waits so he gets a burger. At one point in time, he's driving along and he just pulls over all of a sudden. FBI guy stops all of a sudden. Didn't plan for it. He ended up right behind his car. David gets out, walks to him and says, "Look, I know you're with the FBI. Why don't we save the gas? Why don't you get in the car with me and I'll tell you what I'm doing?" You know, the guy was so freaked, you know, he drove off. I mean, so there's a way to use that. Ira Sandberg talked about when some guy, a thief, trying to rob him on the subway platform. He said, "Give me your money," and Ira said, "Look, I need to get home. I'll give you half." You know, there's ways to turn every situation into a productive situation, if you can. We used to have strikers. We used to have cops. Excuse me, at the strike at San Francisco State, there'd be a line of cops there. I mean, we're talking about 6'4", 240, and with an eye in the middle of the forehead, right? You know, with the big billy club, you know, getting ready to move on us. And we would go up to them and we would say, "Do you know what Abraham Lincoln, the Republican president, said? The bigger the stick, the smaller the man. And boy, would we run. And you can see the sweat coming down their face. You can see the sweat coming down their face, you know, because they really had to think about it. All the African American cops would do a sick out. You know, they wouldn't be part of it. They wouldn't be part of it, you know, and that was because, we would go up to the cops and say, this is all about organizing. Don't you guys have a union? You know, don't you cops have a union? What is your union for? You know, that's what these people are after. Think about that. So there were defections, you know, guys that would not show up that were calling sick. So you can always speak to the humanity of that situation. There was a guy that I was friends with in junior high school at Miller Junior High. And I knew him. We lost contact in high school. I mean, he went off what he did, I did. And when I was involved in People's Park, this story's in the book. When I was involved in People's Park up at Berkeley, they brought in all of these cops from out of town, from other places, who had attitudes about students. You know, draft dodging hippies. You know, and they had attitudes about about students, which I don't get, because most of them were working guys working hard to be able to put their kids in college. Okay, so they had an attitude about college kids. So we were at one point at a demonstration, and they had brought the National Guard in from Fresno. They were guys from Fresno. And when the National Guard moved on me, the National Guardsman that had a bayonet right here on my chest was the kid I'd gone to junior high school with, eye to eye. And the guys all next to him were all guys I'd gone to school with. You could see the sweat coming out over their helmets, you know, and I did not break that eye contact. If he was going to stab me, he was going to watch me. Luckily, they backed those guys off. And I think he let the police department, and shortly thereafter, this is one of those weird circles. With the picture on the front of the book, it's a picture when I was busted on Shaw Avenue. The cop that cuffed me and stuffed me was the same guy. This is like Twilight Zone. Okay, his name is written. It's written right on the arrest record. You know, so it's a small world.
You know, I haven't read the book yet, but it reminds me of Woody Allen's movie Zelig. You know, this character who shows up.
Yeah, there's a comedian, Will Durst, said it sounds like Forrest Gump, only it's real. You know, that was what he said when he read. So, I mean, we all had these circumstances. We all had these. My story is not any different than towards Paul could tell, or John here could tell, or some of the other people here could tell. It's just that I've been blessed with the ability to write. This is my 5th book. You know, so I can write them and share them, and people get excited about the book. But all these guys got stories that'll raise your hair. You know. And I'm telling you, the young people today, and by the time you're in high school, this is going to get real serious. The young people today, there's all this stuff about, you guys are old school. We don't want to listen to old people. You can bet the rent money that all of the people in the right wing are listening to all the old war horses about how to do it. You know? So it's very important that we get young people to say, listen, this is a survival issue. This is a survival issue. You need to pay attention. There's a reason why we got this old. We have something to share. My suggestion is to take whatever opportunities you can in any possible circumstance to share your life story, to share it in poetry, to share it in a song, to share it in a film, to share it in a painting, to share it in a letter to the editor, to share it, go get up in front of a schoolroom and share that story so that what we experienced and what we know and what it means to become a political person is shared with young people. This is all for them. This is all for them. What else is it for? What else is it for? You know? So what I say is to them, what I said to a young group the other day, I said, you know how to become political? I said, you know how you make a thieves omelet? And they said, no. I said, well, first you have to steal 2 eggs. The old Russian proverb. that's what I got. Any other questions? It all turns into a funny story. Okay. Well, the books are for sale. They have them here.